Hey everyone, welcome to week 4 of our Racial Equity and Liberation virtual learning community. It's good to be with you all. Who's in the house today? So let's list in the chat box who's here. And let me know if people may be logging on. Yay, great to see. We have Mara from the Center for Court Innovation. Our friends and family, chosen family from Boise, Idaho are back. Adrian is here from DC. Becca from the University of Idaho. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people may be calling in from. We have San Francisco and Reno and Amanda in Mississippi at the Children's Defense Fund, and so many good people. Hey, we see the Bronx, Seattle. Nicole is in Cleveland. Hannah from the New York City Mayor's Office to combat domestic violence. And so while everybody's logging in, we're super excited to be back with you. We can't believe it's been 4 weeks already, and we always eagerly look forward to our time together. And so as you're getting settled in, we're going to ask everyone, if you can, to grab some paper or a napkin or whatever you like to doodle on, and some markers, pencils, crayons, whatever works for you. Our grounding today is going to give us a chance to do some doodling. So as we're getting set up, please feel free to go and grab some things. And if you're driving or if you're in a place where you're listening on the phone, we welcome you. Welcome you. Hey, Lena from the Women of Color Network. Welcome, everyone. So today's topic, we're talking about identifying systems of power. And when we talk about power in this context, we're really going to be focusing on institutional and structural power, which is different, of course, than our personal power or our collective power, our collaborative power. We really want to make sure that we leave here today, at least being within the conversation about institutional and structural or systemic power. Oftentimes when we're doing this work around ending racism or ending any systems of oppression, the focus is always left to the micro level, right? So like, what are individuals doing to each other, to themselves? What are the behaviors and attitudes that they have that are the predictors and outcomes for their lives? And what we want to have a conversation about today is what's underneath that? How are systems and institutions and our organizations actually influencing the outcomes for people's lives, even without their input? And so just want to ask you to keep holding that definition of power for today, that we're talking about it on the institutional level. That does not mean we do not believe in the power of the collective, that we don't believe in community power, but we really want to zone in on this because our experience has been not just my experience and Rachel's experience and a storyteller's experience, but in the movements to end oppression, and I'm sure in your experience as you're watching, is there's just too much focus on the maladaptive behaviors and too much focus on the symptoms. So just hold that for us as we go through today. And today's artwork, we love the artwork we took at. We are very intentional about the artwork that we curate for this process. And so today's artwork is from the True Colors mural project out of the West Oakland Youth Center. All right, Rachel.
Yes, good morning, everybody. So excited to be back. You know, just so powerful to be in such a large community of practice and seeing everyone responding and really engaging so fully and wholly. So thank you for coming back, and excited to continue to share about who we are. So, you know, every week we get to share a new snippet of our own stories. And so I'm excited to talk today a little bit about who I am again, but yet connecting it still to power. And so my name is Rachael Marie Ibrahim. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I identify as a mixed race Black woman, mixed race cisgendered Black woman raised in the Midwest, in my immediate family being all white, Lebanese, German, and my father being Nigerian, but not necessarily growing up with him. And so you know, each week I've talked about different experiences in growing up in white communities and how that's actually impacted how I show up in the world. And one of the things that I was reflecting on this week is how, you know, my relationship to education. And so even though not feeling like growing up, you know, didn't feel like I necessarily had access to institutional power. When I look back and I can trace my experiences, I can see where being raised in a white family, even though a white family that didn't necessarily have a lot of class leverage, and right, and not necessarily economically doing well, but still being the first of my cousins and of my immediate family to go to college, looking at how did I get access to that institution? How did I get into higher education? I had really poor grades. I wasn't necessarily doing well in high school academically, according to the GPA at least. And but yet, getting into undergrad, it was really being able to have access to my parents. So my parents' decisions and where we moved, where we lived, determined what schools I would go to. And so we moved from poor communities that were more diverse to all white communities that had much different schools with better education. And eventually when I applied to college, even though we didn't necessarily have the cash income for me to go to school, my parents did have access to credit that was able to pay for my first year of college. And so that credit made it possible for me to eventually take out student loans on my own. And so just looking at, again, where their privilege gave them access to institutions, and because of my relationship to them, I was able to get access to institutions. But in my family's absence, I had a very different experience. Whether that was, the questions around how did I get into those institutions? Did I get in because I was Black? I must have been playing some type of sport, which is how I got in, which I actually didn't play sports. Or even my experience with getting pulled over frequently in the town that I grew up in, which was not necessarily the same experience that my family had. And so thinking about how systems responded to me differently, even though I was able to access the privilege of my parents, I couldn't necessarily directly benefit without their presence. And so that's a little bit about my story and how I come today.
Similarly, Rachel. So, hey, everyone, I'm Monica Dennis. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a capacity builder, community organizer, a dancer, a storyteller, and a keeper of stories. I'm a historian in my family, but also a historian in this work that I do. And I'm also thinking about how educational privilege gave me access to so much. And so I was part of busing programs in New York City that identified gifted and talented children of color who were in elementary schools, primary schools, and who could benefit from actually having access to real competition, to real high intellectual rigor, not knowing that we already had that in our community, but the way that systems of power identified who was really smart, who was a leader, what success was whether or not we were able to compete in educational settings where there were white students who had more resources. And so part of that busing program meant I left my community in the South Bronx, went to school in the Bronx, but it was a 2-hour daily commute every day. And what I got access to was also about my proximity to whiteness, right? And so the kinds of networks that began to open up to me, conversations that I began to have were different. They weren't necessarily better, but the way that the markers in society identified as what's successful, that was what I was being told. And so what I find so interesting and complex and sometimes painful is that I did all the right things I was told to do. I went to the right schools, quote unquote. I did the right jobs. I had a long career in quote unquote corporate world. In the corporate, that was not even quote unquote. I was in the corporate world for many, many years. But just what are the markers of success? And those privileges that were afforded to me, I got some class privilege, I got definitely some academic privilege, didn't actually change the reality for like my family members, people that are in my neighborhood, people who are equally and smarter than I am, but just literally did not have access to some of these institutions. It does not change their reality. It also makes me think about, Rachel, how even though I was in conversations or in places of power, systems of power, I actually also wasn't seen as an actual power holder or as a leader within those institutions. So what does it mean when you're doing being a good fill in the blank, whatever that is for all of us. You're following those steps, but yet it does not yield the same outcomes even when you're following these steps. So that's why I think it's so important for us to have this conversation about like, what are the root causes? How are we having disparate outcomes? What's our own personal relationship to power, and on and on and on.
That's right. Thank you, Monica. And we want to hear a little bit from our storytellers as well. So really excited to welcome Lynn Rosenthal and Andrew Santa Ana. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to also ask you to just share a little bit about your stories today. So again, I'm asking you to share your names, your pronouns, who are your people, or the other way of asking it, what are some of the intersections that you live at? And if you could actually take a minute or two and talk about, how did you come to do the work that you're currently doing? And so, Lynn, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here with all of you. I'm a white cisgendered woman. I guess I'm the B in the LGBTQ. Although, in my time when I came out, we talked about bisexuality. Now we think sort of so many more options than that. But that's the language of the time that I came out. And it's interesting that you started by talking about educational privilege. Certainly as a white woman, I come from a family of educators and scientists, mixed heritage in some sense. My father was Jewish from Eastern Central European. There was so much migration that we have very little real understanding of where he came from, but was the first generation born in the US. My mother's family was from the British Irish Isles. They were in large part Quakers. Within our family, we have both people who were persecuted as a result of faith, whether Jewish or Quaker, but we also have persecutors. My mother's family being Quakers, we had, they were very proud of their abolitionist history, but we've also discovered part of that family that were actually slave holders, so slave owners. So, we're sort of grappling with that. But education-wise, because I came from educators and scientists, it was expected that you would take part in higher education. I did, and I had the benefit of that. Although I didn't go to the right schools. I have a bachelor's degree in social work from a state school not known for academics at all, and never pursued education higher than that. So at the time that I had that, I was very attuned to the sense of privilege I had to be there, to have it at all. Later on, when I went to work in relationship with power institutions, I saw also a whole piece of that I didn't have, of the right schools and sort of the white ruling elite that is very networked around those schools. And that was not something that I understood at all. So I stood kind of in the middle of having this amount of privilege from an educational background and then seeing this whole other piece that I had little understanding of at all. And that affected my relationship to power, which I know we'll talk more about. I do the work because I'm a survivor myself. I've experienced multiple forms of violence. But didn't understand any of that until I was recruited to work at the battered women's shelter. And when I was being trained in the dynamics of domestic violence, I finally had a language for what I had experienced as a 19-year-old college student who had dropped out of college and really been derailed for much of my 20s as a result of an abusive relationship. But we didn't have a language, we didn't talk about it at that time. So it was only many years later I started to really understand it. And I was also recruited into the work from the Women in Prison Committee in Florida. I saw some folks in the chat room from Florida. At that time, 20-some years ago, there was a very active group of women in prison who were seeking remedies and seeking clemency. And I was recruited to do some speaking on their behalf. And that's when I really started to immerse myself and understand about women's experiences with violence.
Lynn, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, or what you did before, what you have been doing? Yeah.
So I now work with the Biden Foundation. That's a new position. I've just started there, and it's a startup foundation. Prior to that, I served in the White House for 5 years. I was the White House advisor on violence against women. So I worked in the vice president's office, to develop new initiatives to address gender-based violence. And before that, I really come from sort of the grassroots. I worked in women's health centers, feminist women's clinics, abortion rights, and battered women's shelters and rape crisis centers. So I come really very much from the NGO sector.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Welcome. Andrew.
Hey, everybody. My name is Andrew Santa Ana. I identify as a cisgender queer male. I was born and raised in New York City. I identify as someone who lives at like the intersection of Staten Island, where I was born and raised, to Brooklyn, where I live now, to Manhattan, where I like do most of my work. Actually, not exclusively. I also work in Queens and the Bronx. I identify as someone who is like deeply in love with Filipino culture and still eats rice for breakfast, but sometimes has pancakes for dinner. I'm someone who enjoys the privilege or has the privilege of being a cisgender male, but also has to sometimes fight for my queer masculinity. I identify as someone who has and often occupies the space of a racial middle when we talk about how we address anti-Black racism and white privilege, and what does it mean to be an ally to folks addressing anti-Black racism. So those are some of the intersections I occupy. It's funny when you talked about this question about education, because I definitely am a proud graduate of public school. I went to Catholic school for the first 8 years of my life, but I went to a public high school, I went to a public college, and I went to a public graduate school. So big ups to CUNY Law. But I also think about what it means to occupy those spaces and on whose shoulders I stand in those spaces, right? So when you were talking earlier, Rachel, it reminded me of parent-teacher conferences when I was younger. And I remember, this young queer kid without the language to call himself queer, but thinking about how my parents would go to parent-teacher conferences with their sort of heavily accented English with a Filipino accent, and what shame I had associated with that, and then what it took to kind of get over that, and how the legacy of things like that resonated throughout my entire life with respect to who belongs here, who earns this position, who gets to access these things and who gets to pass in that way, right? So yeah, thank you for that question. And as to the question of how I got to the work that I do, I'm the director of legal services at an organization called Day One. We work here out of New York City, and we work with young people aged 24 and under who've experienced dating and sexual violence in their intimate relationships. And I wish I could say that it was a linear path, but it hasn't been. From a young age, because I grew up in a large immigrant family, I was always interested in questions of who gets to come to the United States, who gets to stay here, and who has to leave. And those questions were a really big part of my childhood, because I always thought about people come here for financial reasons, or people come here for opportunities, because in my family education was everything. So you go raise your kids in the United States and you get an education, then you get a graduate degree. That was the plan for my parents. Their retirement plan is us. My brothers and I, little did they know that they have 2 public interest lawyers and a doctor who works at a clinic in Harlem, which enjoys its own privileges, certainly. But yeah, I went to college thinking I was going to work with, and law school thinking I was going to work with low-wage immigrant workers. But of course, with life, there's coming out, there's analysis around violence that sort of unfolded as I, sort of continued in my career. And I was really interested in working, at least in violence against women and LGBT domestic violence, or what does it look like to examine intimate partner violence that isn't grounded in a gender binary. And through that work, I was interested in violence generally and what causes violence and how do you prevent violence, which led me to my position now, where I do direct services, but also really think deeply about what is it to end violence in ways that certainly involve remedies that are available through the legal system and social service system, but was also deeply grounded in the understanding that in and of itself isn't big enough of a container to address all of the complexity that leads people to use harm, or to think that that's the way to address conflict.
Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really want to just welcome you both. And, if we think about, when are we going to get to the work? Like, we are doing it, right? Like, these stories, our stories, are the analysis of power. The more we break it down. And so just really appreciating the clarity that you have around your own stories. And so that's what we're doing today. We're going to actually do our regular opening. So we have our rituals as you know it, and then we're going to really focus this conversation with Lynn and Andrew around systems of power. And so, as you know, that means we're going to ground together. And so hopefully you went and got your colored pencils or your markers or your crayons, or maybe you got a pencil, and that is fine, whatever you have. I got my colored pencils here, and I got a little notebook right here. So just going to ask you, grab something, and just to have that in front of you for a moment. Have that in front of you as we take just a couple of minutes to ground ourselves. And so I'm going to ask everyone to take 30 seconds and just breathe at your own pace. And so we're just going to pause and breathe. And we have to keep breathing to keep living. And so I'm going to ask you to keep breathing and take a marker or a colored pencil or something and just doodle for a few minutes or a few moments. You can actually doodle the entire time of this webinar, actually. I'm going to encourage you to use your hands in a way that helps you to stay present. And so you might doodle and just, it might be images, it might be words, it might be absolutely abstract. And I'm going to give a few prompts as you continue to doodle. As we ground ourselves in a conversation about power, I'm going to ask us to just think of the colors and the images that come to mind when I think about being in my own power. The power that often can be undermined, but that is actually my power to be fully human. To have a sense of agency. Not about control, not about authority or having authority over, but a sense of agency. Doodling as I think about the sense of power that each of us are born with. Regardless of our ability to influence systemic change, I am still born whole. We are born whole. And so we carry this sense of agency with us through this conversation. Stay grounded and connected to whatever our source of power and agency is. And so with this grounding, you can keep doodling, right? We don't stop grounding. We continue to ground and reground over and over again. And just going to ask everyone to presence whatever helps you to connect with your source of power. Because oftentimes in this conversation, we can feel disconnected from our own sense of agency.
Mm-hmm. You know, Rachel, even in the chat, we're talking about this right now. So I really appreciate the grounding that you just brought about remembering. It reminded me of who I am. And who my people are and who all of our peoples are. I know Luce was talking in the chat about just how what are the messages we receive when we don't go to the right schools or we don't have the degrees and our experience is still valid. And so your grounding just reminds us that our experiences are valid. Our experience, I thought I lost you there. Our experiences are valid. And yeah, our experiences are valid. And so for today's acknowledgements, want to acknowledge our heroes, our sheroes, our forebears, all of those folks, but really are asking people today to actually, in the chat, lift up people who are outside of the system, but whose humanity you value, right? So when I think about my aunts, my grandmothers, my parents, my uncles, people in my community who did not have access to the education that I got, but actually are smarter, more wise. All of these powerful things are way makers and have shown me the way. So if we could lift up some of the names of folks and to not forget our young folks and our elders. And so I'm going to ask Andrew and Lynn, if you just have a name. You don't have to give us the story right now, but the name. I'll start with Andrew and then Lynn, and then Rachael. Who's your person?
I have two. They're my aunties who raised my dad when my paternal grandmother died. My auntie Ini and auntie Putin, which were short in like this Filipino like nickname way for Potencia and Francesca. Auntie Putin and auntie Ini.
Thank you.
I had to bring my mother, Mickey Rosenthal, who just had an amazing ability to see the future, and she would talk about the future in ways that as a child I couldn't understand, and now I've seen some of it, so I would bring my mother.
Thank you. Rachael?
Yes, I'm thinking of my Aunt Kelly Felsky, and so she's on my mind this morning, and definitely bringing her along today. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Monica. You know, and acknowledgement is such an essential practice, and so there's many practices that we're lifting up throughout this series, and one of those other practices is how do we hold space together in using these community agreements. And so we revisit them every week. You know, it might seem repetitive, but you know what? Even the choir needs practice. And so just to remind ourselves that these are the agreements that we're holding. I'm going to name them, but really just as a refresher and to continue to reflect on which community agreements are easier for you to hold and which ones do you feel resistance or actually forget about sometimes. And so just to have that as a question in your mind as we continue forward. And so we ask everyone to listen actively, to engage in active listening, to be present, to be fully present, and to know that sometimes when we get uncomfortable, we get to push through our growing edge and be with that discomfort and do the work anyway. That we acknowledge that there's no quick fix, that these issues started a long time ago and they will continue, and we will continue to do the work, and that we are going to trust the process. And sometimes that's our own process, sometimes that's a collective process, or even this process that we are leading and guiding. That we're going to remember that we do this work at the intersections, and so looking at racism and other oppressions, the many identities that we hold, so that way we are not compartmentalized, and that we can be fully human and present. And that we're going to lead with acknowledging the impact of our words and actions, so that way we can actually get to healing and wholeness in our work. So that's what we're going to use to guide us today and always.
Great. And so I'm going to move us into our frame for today. As I was talking on the top of the conversation when we were first logging in, that what we're focusing in on is how systems of power operate. Not that we don't acknowledge and honor our own individual and collective power to make change. And we that's very important. And what we're talking about today is really what's the root cause of what is happening to people's lives. So when we were watching the video, we had the video as our pre-work called Born Poor and Stay Poor. And the opening shot, so the opening montage talks about only 4% of all people make it outside of poverty. And so that means that we actually have to ask ourselves the question, is it that poor people just want to be poor? Or are there systemic institutional policies, practices, and ways of being that are actually keeping people poor, even though in the United States we value wealth and all of these things, right? Not necessarily on this call, but that there's so much value on what it means to be wealthy, but it seems that the majority of people who are born poor actually stay poor. So when we talk about systems of power, we're talking about a conversation that focuses on root causes rather than individual behaviors, that asks us to look at the causes of inequity, that challenges us to look at our relationships, which is why we have our storytellers here to help us unpack some of the relationships we have to power. And that when we do that, we can actually be in a practice of coming up with different solutions than we generally come up with, right? And so when we think about answers to criminalization or to ending gender-based violence, often criminalization is the first response, meaning we need more police in order to generate safety. Well, that's not actually what most people want in their communities, or all people want in their communities. And so how do we actually look at how criminalization impacts our communities differently at the root level to come up with a different solution? So that's what we're here today to talk about. Also, we have here in our PowerPoint, which everybody will receive a copy of, are some questions. So whenever we're doing a power analysis, there are a few questions that I'll lift up, but they'll be here for you. It's about asking, what are the external factors that are influencing and shaping our everyday realities? What are some of the power policies and practices creating unsatisfactory outcomes for some and expanded privilege for others? What are some of the single stories and implicit biases that are reinforcing those inequities? Are we actually engaging people as powerful leaders? So people that are most impacted by the work that we're doing, or ourselves, because we're not outside of that work, right? As all of us as participants on this call have listed, we are in many intersections. How are we being engaged, and how are we actually engaging people at the center who are impacted as though they're at the center? So that's what we're up to today. Rachel's going to provide a little bit more context too. So hopefully if you're on the PowerPoint, you can see the next slide.
Yeah, thank you for that frame, Monica, because there's so many different ways that we can do a power analysis. And so, asking those questions are essential for us to really look at, so who has power? Who has power? How did it get there? And how is it being used? And how did it get taken away? And so one of the ways that we look at this, and while this can be a simplified way to look at power, it does help us look at some distinctions. And so if we see that line right there in the middle as power, right? Power in the United States specifically. When whatever is above the line, we look at, who has been given power, who has assumed power, not because they necessarily asked for it, but because it has been granted, right? So how systems are responding to people's identities. And then when we look what's below the line, who is without access or has limited access to power. And so we see that, I'm going to just name a few because there's so many up here, on above the line in terms of who has access to power, looking at being cisgendered, being male, English speaking, citizen, a homeowner, Christian, being white, heterosexual, right? That we know that these are some of the identities that have been given institutional access to power, even if people above this line don't necessarily feel powerful on the day-to-day, right? And then we know what's below the line have been people who have historically had to fight for access to power. And so we're talking about people who are incarcerated, who are darker skinned, people of color, youth, people who are renting, people who are trans, immigrant, right? Undereducated, underemployed, unemployed, right? That the list goes on. And so what we think is important is, one, to identify that not all of these identities are weighted equally, and systems don't necessarily respond to all of these identities the same. So just to pull out one example would be to be a college graduate or to be a homeowner is not necessarily weighted the same as being cisgendered or being white, right? And so we recognize that there's some distinctions above and below the line. And one of the things that we want to make a distinction between is between power and privilege, right? And so what we're talking about in terms of power is how people have been granted access to institutions, and that oftentimes privilege can help someone gain that access, right? And so we know that privilege is not necessarily something that people ask for, but that it is granted, whether because being assumed innocent, being assumed trustworthy, being assumed safe, because of the way someone appears. And oftentimes whiteness, right, being a quote unquote professional, like these kinds of identities can inform whether or not someone is seen in that light. And so we think it's really important for us to look beyond privilege to be able to see, so what does that mean in terms of how much access someone is granted based on the assumptions of those identities? And how does that then inform who gets to shape policy, who is determining practices and programs within our institution?
Yeah, and so in the chat, we're asking people to list, like, if you think of what Rachel's just talking about, what aspects of your identity are above the line?
Yes.
And what aspects are below, right? And so you can just list below and then list those. Yes.
No, sorry. No, and I'm just thinking about how much this stays connected to, our previous sessions around looking. This is part of how we also locate ourselves and get beyond the single story, but it's how important it is for us to be able to, in order for us to analyze our relationship to power, we have to be able to locate ourselves to do so. It means naming some of those things that can be uncomfortable, that are above the line, and also knowing when we are below the line, and sometimes for our safety.
That's right. And that the point that you make, so as people are listing, again, to just reemphasize that there's a differential in systems of power. And so, Rachel, I know there's a story that we talk about, and it's not a story. I hate to even call it a story because it's someone's lived experience that we share as a story that really crystallizes how systemic power responds differently to our different identities.
Absolutely. And, the preface I want to give in telling, around this, again, this feels strange calling it a story, around the situation that happened, is it's a violent example, but it's not necessarily, we've been talking about violence because racism is also violent. And so while this can be a triggering example, we want to recognize that racism in and of itself is a trigger, right? And so wanting to name that as we talk about the specific example of the case of Charles Stewart. And I'm not sure if folks are remembering who Charles Stewart is or was, but he was a white cisgendered man from Boston. And, in 1989, he took his wife, his pregnant wife, a white woman, for a drive. And he drove to the neighborhood of Mission Hill in Boston. And he pulled out a gun and he killed his pregnant wife. And he then shot himself, and then he put the gun under his seat. And, when we talk about systems of power, this is a perfect example of how systems respond to Charles Stewart, how he knew he could access his white privilege, his white male privilege, to be able to get systems to respond to him, even though he was guilty of the crime. And so I want to just name how that went down. So what we know about this case is that the healthcare responded to Charles Stewart because he received the medical attention that he needed. We know that the media responded to Charles Stewart by doing a number of things. One, projecting an image of a so-called, when he put that gun under his seat, he then called the police and said, we were mugged by a black man. And so a manhunt ensued that then projected an image all across the media of a false black man who then raids then happened all across the neighborhood of Roxbury. And so when we think about what that means, literally police officers using battle rams to break down the doors of community members, and so elderly black women literally dropping dead because of the terror. We know that the image then led to a black man confessing to a crime that he did not commit because fear tactics were used against him. We know that utility companies, so again, systems that are responding to Charles Stewart, utilities responded to his case by shutting off the electricity and the utilities to that neighborhood, which forced people on a summer day to come out of their homes. And so, so that way they didn't necessarily need warrants to go into people's homes. Another criminal justice responded to him in a way that gave him the benefit of the doubt. They didn't test his hands for gunpowder residue. They didn't even check under the seat for the gun. And lastly, we know that the insurance companies responded to him because a check was cut for the death of his wife, and that he received those monies. And so when we think about all of the systems that responded on his behalf, didn't necessarily matter whether or not he liked black people, but he knew that his white privilege would gain him access to institutions that would respond on his behalf without him having to ask for it. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about institutional power, the policies, the response, the practices, and the programs that are put into place that benefit and maintain white power and privilege. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so we're just going to actually take a minute to just be with what you just shared, because it's super powerful and painful, and actually also speaks to how white supremacy also works against white women, right? That because Charles Stewart has the benefit of patriarchy, that even in crimes of violence between intimate partners who are white, he is not the first go-to. And that has to do with not only patriarchy, but it also has to do with racism, that white men in particular are upheld as the standard bearers. And so, Andrew, our first question is to you. Our next question is around, like, what are some of the single stories? Because there are a lot of single stories, a lot of implicit bias, a lot of embedded inequities just in what Rachael shared. And so when you're doing your work on behalf of young people, what are some of the embedded single stories that you're seeing and patterns that you're seeing that institutions and particularly the legal system is perpetuating?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for that. I think when we talk about single stories, I think and sort of structural racism and institutionalized oppression in particular, it's the kind of rush to the single stories around what a violent person looks like or what a dangerous person looks like. And so working here in New York City on behalf of largely but not exclusively young women of color, it's recognizing that their partners, often people who are cisgender males, are committing violence against them for which they want remedies, but also recognizing that the solutions that are currently available are in some ways helpful, in some ways not, right? And so for young people that want the violence to stop but not want their partner potentially deported, for people that want sort of an order of custody but want their abusive partner or their ex-partner to have some kind of relationship with their children, how do we like fully articulate that? And then how does that connect to other systems for which other people are, sort of historically and continually monitored, right? So for people experiencing violence, what does that mean for someone who is investigated by Child Protective Services and their form of self-medication is through drinking or buying something off the street versus somebody who has, health insurance and a prescription for, pain meds that they can use that are, sort of legally fine, right? So when we think about how all of these systems intersect, it's important to like recognize where that comes from and whose stories are at the table, whose go untold, and how particularly in the legal system, it's the role of advocates to to get the result that their client is looking for, but also explain to them and to understand that that takes place within a context, right? So that someone can be the survivor of violence and they can also be really powerful, and that they can resist the violence that they experience by their intimate partner. And in the case of young women of color, for example, who are resisting sort of acting on the resilience that they're experiencing from their intimate partners, how is then that not interpreted as like sort of tired stereotypes about like angry Latinas or Black women, right? Like, how do we hold that says that like in the course of surviving, survivors and victims and young people and queer people are going to rely on things that they need to survive, and how that often lines up in our criminal justice system and our criminal legal system is complicated, and how the system will sort of railroad you into single story, into that easy narrative.
Yes.
And what are the things that we do to challenge that?
Thank you. And so, Lynn, also similarly, what are the ways, like, so that you see policy and practices and programs actually creating disparate outcomes for some and privileges for others, even as it's trying to do a good thing? So I don't know if you want to talk about, maybe perhaps you want to talk about the Violence Against Women's Act or some other experiences that you have. And then, yes, everybody, we will definitely tell you what happened in the Charles Stewart case.
Sure. So, and I think there are people here on this webinar who have really been exploring this history as well. Certainly, the Violence Against Women Act was really drafted based on the experiences of white women. So the first version of it, I mean, there's been a lot of effort to improve over the years, but the core work that was really examined to set the model for VAWA was work that had happened in predominantly white communities, where the problem that had been identified was sort of patriarchal violence and patriarchal systems, and not race. And so that meant that only that piece that you described was addressed in those early programs. So for white women who were at the table, many of whom themselves were survivors, they were thinking of what sort of systems reform would benefit them and the women that they knew, and not the full picture, in spite of really the very early warnings. You know, you've all probably read Beth Ritchie's writings and others who noted at that moment in time, it's a moment in time where women of color really warned those early activists that going in this direction would cause a lot of harm to communities of color, and still we went as white activists in that direction. And I think we can point to it as a moment in time where that separation occurred, because prior to that, this sort of movement was actually quite multiracial. Even when I came into the battered women's movement in the early 90s, it was multiracial. There was a lot of grassroots organizing. There was a caucus structure where we dealt with racism and homophobia and a lot of issues. And so just perhaps when we were getting somewhere, this split occurred because white women went in this particular direction that we could see the benefit of, and did not fully examine or heed the warnings of women of color who said this is the harm that would be created. So I can't say also that's been successful even for white women, that our systems reform for gender-based violence has not been successful for white women, but it hasn't caused the kind of destructive harm that it has caused to communities of color. So, I mean, myself as a survivor of multiple forms of violence as a white woman, there's never been any systems involvement. Even though I have, a history of long-term addiction in my family, a history of violence and abuse, a lived experience of violence and abuse, never did I as a white woman get dragged into a system and experience that kind of re-victimization. And I can see that now, sort of looking back, as a function of white privilege and white supremacy, that I was not further harmed by systems. I didn't necessarily deal correctly with the harm I experienced myself, but I wasn't further harmed. And so I think VAW was a good example. There are others. I think a lot about the child support enforcement system. So a robust child support enforcement system benefits, often white women who had affluent partners, whose partners then were taking and hiding their assets. And so a robust child enforcement, the language around deadbeat dads even, benefits white women who can then use that system to get assets back. But when we look at poor men and men of color who are then become even more poor as a result of the way that system plays out, and particularly when in the welfare in TANF, where child support enforcement payments actually are made to the state, not even to the family. So there's not even an ability for someone to informally care for their family or for their children. So I think there's a lot of questions in that particular system around who benefits from it. And I think sometimes for white women in policy-making roles, this sort of disconnect from the fuller picture happens all the time. And particularly for me, thinking of the habits of white supremacy and the sense of urgency, like this has to be fixed now, here's one solution, let's do it, let's scale it up, without a full understanding of who's actually harmed by that. It's something we're grappling with, I think, today, every day, and also that we have an opportunity to do things differently. I think we do.
Yeah. So want to name that you all are doing a power analysis without us having to have the specific questions, right? And so wanting to see if we can, asking the participants to key into the level of analysis and nuance that is actually analyzing power, whether we have those specific questions. So even if we go back to Andrew's original questions about when you think about immigration, you think about who gets to come to the U.S., who gets to stay, and who has to leave. That is a power analysis. Those are the questions that are underneath that. And so we're going to ask another question, but Rachel, people are really eager to hear about what happened to Charles Stewart.
Yes, and I am so sorry for leaving y'all hanging on that. That was not part of the plan. But I want to say, so Charles Stewart, the reason why we found out about the truth about his case was that he confessed to his brother, and his brother turned him in, and then Charles Stewart committed suicide. And we know that the black man who was arrested for that crime did serve the time. So just wanted to let you all know how that actually went. Thank you, Mom.
Thank you. And so we can also Google and find there's a lot of information on that. So both for Andrew and Lynn, part of our work talks about locating ourselves, and we do that every call. And when we ask people to share where they are above the line or below the line, where our identities fall, is so we can actually not only get in touch with our stories, but also talk a little bit about how we reconcile our own relationships to power. So I think about the ways in which, as someone that grew up with a mantra of like, you got to work hard, like not make any waves, don't embarrass your family, so much riding on my potential for class privilege, that the ways in which when I'm in systems of power, if I'm not conscious, if I don't have accountable relationships, I can actually be co-opted by systems of power. So here, and I really need that touchstone. So would love to hear about from you, how have you reconciled, what's been your journey in reconciling your personal and professional relationships to systems of power while you're still doing amazing work?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. This is Andrew again. It's funny when you had that line of like who's below and above. I kept thinking about how I show up for the people that have showed up for me, right? So it's like this young queer kid in Staten Island in this like Irish Italian neighborhood. Like the people who always showed up for me were frankly like the girls in my class that were also bullied. And so it's funny, right? Like now that I occupy this space with a graduate degree as a professional, as a male who speaks unaccented English, like how do I, one, like sort of not necessarily pay back that debt, but more so connect my liberation to the liberation of everybody else, and to know that we have to do that work together. And what that specifically means as a cisgender male working in the movement to end violence against women and girls is like really knowing that like it's there are conversations that I can offer perspectives to, but I'm not the one who like I don't get a pass on it because I'm doing this work either, right? Like, and that means surrounding myself or being community deeply with like women of color who are wonderful and who call me in when I need to be called in, and help me inform and deepen my analysis. So when I think about, like how that relates to personal institutional power, it means like leveraging the things that I have access to, some of the things that I was born into, or some of the things that were granted upon me because of education, and then trying to make more space to agitate, to organize, to tell different stories, to ask different questions in places where those questions haven't historically been asked, and kind of listening to the conversations that come from it.
I would jump in too and say, I think, and I've been thinking a lot about this, that, so many white women who've experienced gender-based violence walk around in this place of trauma, and that's the purpose of gender-based violence, to keep us off balance. But we have an obligation to do our healing, because unless we do our healing, we're not able to participate fully in sort of fighting white supremacy, really, if we walk around this constant place. So for me, when I worked in the White House, so that's like the seat of institutional power, and I didn't access my own personal power well to serve as a liberated gatekeeper, to do all the things I would want to do if I could do it over. I had so much fear and anxiety all the time, which was a large result of my own unhealed trauma. So when I think of white women, I know whiteness has come up on some of these webinars, is this idea that white women's obligation to heal is not so we can center ourselves in interacting and creating more institutional power or centering ourselves in a response to gender-based violence. It's so that we can participate more fully. So, I mean, I didn't utilize first, and also I had been an advocate activist from the grassroots. I'd never imagined myself being in a place of institutional power, so I didn't know how to use those levers very well to make things happen. There were some moments where I realized I could push that door open, but certainly not enough. So I think this is what this work is really all about, that the personal, our ability to interact with institutional power in a way to leverage what we need for our people is often dependent on our own ability to function well in those environments. And it's hard to do. And I can't say that I did it well in the way I can look back now and say I could have done it.
Yeah, what you're talking about is so important. Also want to lift up what's happening in the chat. And Rachel, please come in with the question. We'll probably go a few minutes over just so everybody knows that. So people are mentioning also in the chat that there are communities that are also having this conversation. So we'll keep posting a list of resources. But just wanting again to highlight that we are doing a power analysis. So Susan Smith is another story. But there are so many stories that are happening that make the public domain. But also part of this practice is thinking about how is this showing up in the work that I'm doing now? How do I see disparate outcomes happening for some? And if I can't, am I in relationship in other communities that they can actually inform and share their experiences? Rachel?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, one of the things we want to look at as we talk about power is that even in this conversation, we've given privilege to those who are doing racial equity work in institutions or in organizations. And so, we know that a 501c3 is not going to give us liberation. When we really think about, what this work is, what we need to be able to leverage in order to do this work. We know that we need systems change to happen both from people inside and outside of institutions. And so really just wanted to ask, Andrew and Lynn, if you could each take, a minute or less to share your reflections around, can you share about how do you stay grounded on a grassroots level of organizing to leverage power that isn't necessarily connected to an organizational structure? And so if you could just say, brief something to that.
I think that's actually the best way to work. And when I look back on some of the best work I've ever been a part of, it's when we were working in small groups outside of systems to create change for ourselves and communities. And now I think with social media, that can be so greatly amplified. So I think you can be more nimble, you can be more creative, you can grow more fully, I think, often outside of organizational structure. So I think that's in many ways the best way to work.
Yeah, I've said this before. I always say that the revolution is planned at a queer POC happy hour, right? So there's the people that you connect with in your community who are maybe doing the same work, and then after work you get together and then talk about how that went and what needs to change. And then I think within your organization there are conversations that you can have that aren't necessarily funded, right? So we can have conversations about race at our organization, or we started a book club, and now we're reading the Hate You Give. We just read Americana. So like, how do you build community within your organization, knowing that the people even that you work with are experiencing the impact of structural oppression, and there needs to be an outlet to create that, and that outlet can be, I don't know, like at a happy hour, or it can be at a brown bag, right? And so how do we organize and acknowledge the humanity of even people who are working in the nonprofit system are struggling with?
That's right. And what I hear you also saying is like in order for us to really leverage power, to shift how institutions are seeing us at the intersections, is that we have to have accountable relationships both within institutions and outside of institutions. And like, how are we looking at that relationship as essential for our organizing, to really inform the direction that we're heading in. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, and so for next, I can't believe the time is already up. Because it always goes so fast, and I'm just riveted by what you're all sharing. And there's just want to echo all the resonance that is in the chat, right? And so there are resources. People are talking about an upcoming webinar that Mimi Kim, a longtime organizer who's based in the Bay Area, who's going to host a free webinar next week called Dancing the Carceral Creep, the Feminist Anti-Violence Movement and the Pursuit of Criminalization. So just to share that out there, some folks are asking about the books we've referenced. So Beth Ritchie's Arrested Justice, that talks about the relationship between criminalization and violence and movement to end violence. And then also Lynn referenced the Habits of White Supremacy. So Tama Okun, whose name I'll put in the chat, is also a person, a white organizer coming out of Durham, North Carolina, who's worked in multiracial settings to actually identify what are the habits of white supremacy that we can actually show up and see in our organizational culture. And then wanting to bring it all in to the point that both of you are making, that sometimes we think of systems change, that change only has to happen within the systems. But part of what I found when I go to work, quote unquote, or go to these organizations, I'm actually looking for my tribe. I'm looking for my people that I can do the work with. And so while I might not think my focus is to change the system, I'm always trying to connect with people, like whether it's at the happy hour or have my own happy hour internally, that then begins to create a base that then shifts culture. So just wanting to, I know there are a lot of organizers and advocates on these calls, to really be able to think about like, who are you organizing with, and how do we see it as a spiral, and not just let's go and take out the ED who is the most, person who's against our agenda, but to really think of it as base building, to bring a grassroots approach to our work within organizations. Any closing? Yeah, Rachel, please.
Yeah. As we move to close, I know Monica's gonna do a great reveal of our last song, or not of our last song, but of the song to close out today. I just actually want to encourage that while we listen to this song, that we, as we think about what's next, the messages that you've internalized about power, and as you reflect on noticing when and how you analyze power in your daily interactions, I'm gonna ask you to actually, in the chat, as we listen to our closing song, reflect on the learnings from today's conversation that's going to actually support you in being able to identify your daily interactions with power. And so just share what you've learned from today and how you're going to apply it as we listen to this awesome song.
Yeah, and while that's coming up, just thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Andrew and Lynn. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And wanted to, again, remind folks that we're using social media to keep the conversation going. So we know that this might feel like a short time, but hashtag real communities, hashtag systems of power, and to fill out your eval as well. And then our last, May 26th, our last webinar, will actually have a time where it'll probably be mostly questions. So it'll just be myself and Rachel engaging you in whatever topics that are part of this series. So today's song is called All My People by Kindred the Family Souls.
Yeah.
So Chelsea's gonna play it for us.
The sun is shining, the air is clear, my folks are smiling, no need for fear. The kids are learning what they should learn. Finally, folks are should earn.
Take the power.
All my people around me. Everybody living good. Everybody eating good. Everybody should. I want all my people around me. Everybody eating good. Everybody living good. There's a
Yeah, so the song is a little muffled, but we'll ask Chelsea to turn it down a little bit. But the song again is called All My People by Kindred the Family Soul. And it pretty much says, I want all my people all around me, everybody eating good, everybody living good. I want for my brother and I want for my sister what I want for myself. So when we think about power, that's what we're talking about. We want all our people around us living good. So have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next time. And happy Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Have a good week, everybody.